Genshin Impact just announced the banners for version 5.5, and let me tell you one thing, you will love them. So, in this video, we're gonna talk about all the upcoming characters, how they work, which teams they perform best in, and we will also take a look at the weapon banners so you can make the best decision on what to pull for your personal account. And with all that being said, let's jump right into it. Alright, let's now dive into the characters. But before we get to the 4 5-star characters, I actually want to talk about the new 4-star, Xianyun, first because I think it is important to understand her kit before we start talking about the new 5-star, Varesa. So, Xianyun, here we go. Xianyun will probably be a very valuable, very strong buffing unit and fill a relatively similar role to Bennett in the sense that Xianyun, just like him, will use her elemental burst to provide a fat attack buff. However, here is the kicker. Where, in the case of Bennett, your attack buff is limited to your circle impact and once you move out of it, you don't have it anymore, Xianyun is going to be the polar opposite in the sense that her attack buff will follow you around and it will be stronger and stay active for longer if you move around a lot. So, just like I said, the exact opposite of Bennett. This attack buff that Xianyun provides will be based on her overall attack, so unlike Bennett, it's not only about the weapon that you equip, but all the attack that you build on her, so you want to have a lot of that. And also, she's gonna have an Ascension passive where she can provide a little bit of healing, also based on her attack, when nearby party members trigger Night Soul bursts. I personally believe that not only will Xianyun be probably the optimal buffer for the new 5-star Varesa, but I think specifically for many other DPS characters out there, like for example Clorand, who like to not just stay in one spot but actually move around a bit, where circle impact has always been a bit of a pain, I think in those situations Xianyun is going to be a very great choice, and I think a lot of accounts out there would benefit greatly from getting her. And just by the way, if you could maybe drop a little like for the video, that would be super amazing because it always helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm. Cheers so much for your support. But now, with all of that in mind, let's now talk about the phase of the banner that you're probably most looking forward to, and that would be what I like to call the plunge phase, featuring Varesa as well as Xianyun. First of all, Varesa is an on-field DPS using a catalyst and her element is Electro. If you ask me, from what they showed on stream, it looked a little bit confusing as to what her kit might look like, so I'm gonna try to put it in relatively simple words. Varesa is an on-field DPS character who mainly revolves around charged and plunging attacks, but at the same time loves to move around on the battlefield quite a lot. Her elemental skill is mainly used for said movement and also to fuel your other more offensive moves, and then the main portion of your damage is going to come from the charged and plunging attacks. So overall, I would say Varesa is going to be quite the active character to play. Now, in terms of damage numbers, of course we didn't see anything yet, but I would say it isn't all too far-fetched to assume that probably she is gonna take the top spot in terms of Electro DPSs in the game, and therefore unfortunately power creep my girl Clorand, who, if you ask me, up until this point has been the strongest Electro DPS in the game. But now, even though Varesa hasn't released yet, when it comes to her team options, we can actually already say quite a lot. First of all, and that is also the reason why we talked about Xianyun first, Xianyun will of course be the top support for Varesa, not only providing big attack buffs, but also benefiting from the fact that Varesa wants to move around a lot. As we remember, this is exactly what Xianyun needs. So yeah, Varesa and Xianyun are already set. Then, another character that you probably also want to have for the ideal Varesa team would be the other 5-star featured on that banner, Xianyun, simply because Xianyun is the best plunge attack buffer in the game, no further explanation needed. And then the 4th team slot is relatively flexible. You could fit in Xilonen as a great off-field support, but given the fact that your ideal team already has Xianyun, and Xianyun is a team-wide healer as well, that means I would suspect that Farina is probably also going to be a great fit as a second damage buffer here, because she synergizes not only so well with Xianyun, but also she doesn't contradict the Varesa playstyle because her buffs are not AoE restricted and therefore you're free to move as much as you like. However, someone like Bennett, for example, I don't think he would be all too amazing with Varesa because of his restrictive circle impact. But even though I personally think her best team will be with Yansan, Xianyun, and Furina, since Varesa is Electro, I could also imagine maybe an overload team with Chevreuse, where you would pair her up with Mawika, Chevreuse, as well as Yansan. I would suspect that is probably also relatively good, but of course we'll have to wait and see once she comes out. As for whether you should pull her or not, I would say, first and foremost, play her trial once she releases, and if her playstyle resonates with you, then that is definitely cool. But keep in mind that since she is a plunge character, and plunge is still a relatively niche playstyle, that means if you really want to get the most out of Varesa, you gotta make sure to also have the characters that really make her shine, like Yansan and Xianyun. If you don't have them, I think the damage numbers will be significantly lower. But now that we already mentioned Xianyun so often, let's now also take a look at what she actually provides. See, Xianyun is an Anemo Catalyst character, and she is a team-wide healer as well as a plunge attack buffer. First of all, with her Elemental Burst, she will heal the entire team continuously over time, therefore a great synergy with Furina. And what's even better here, unlike the other team-wide Anemo healer, Jean, Xianyun's heal is not limited to a circle impact, but freely follows you around. And her Elemental Burst also provide great buffs for the entire team. First of all, with her first Ascension passive, when you hit enemies with your elemental skill, you give a crit rate bonus for plunge attacks to the team. And then her fourth Ascension passive makes it that when you're under the influence of her elemental burst, of her heal, then plunging attacks will be buffed based on her attack. So, as we also said previously with Varesa, the perfect buffer for any plunge attack team. But not only does she buff plunge attacks while in her burst state, also, characters who previously couldn't even do plunge attacks will gain the ability to do so when under influence of her burst. So, long story short, when should you get Xianyun? Well, either if you want to build a plunge attack team around, for example, Varesa or also Gaming, who is a great plunge attack DPS, or if you like Furina a lot and you still need a team-wide healer to synergize with her, then I would also say Xianyun is a great option, not only because of her heal, but also due to the fact that she is an Anemo character and therefore can run the Viridescent Venerer set to provide additional resistance shred. However, if you're not a fan of plunge attacking, and you also don't need another healer for Furina, in that case, I would say Xianyun is a definite skip. In fact, if you don't like plunge attacks, then both Varesa and Xianyun are definite skips. So much for the first phase. In the second phase though, we also have some really great options with Xilonen as well as Venti. Let's talk about Xilonen first. I am very happy that she already has her first rerun because some say, and there is an argument to be made here, that Xilonen is currently the best character in the game. She is an off-field geo support, and what she brings to the table is really amazing. First of all, with her elemental skill, she gives 15 seconds of resistance shred. This resistance shred applies to all the elements that you have in your party, and it is not limited to an AoE or something. It follows you around, so this is not only super duper strong, but also convenient and, in my opinion, the better version of Kazuha. However, that's not all. With her elemental burst, she can do two things. Either if she is in a mainly geo-focused team, she deals AoE geo damage, but if there are at least two other characters with non-geo aligned elements, then her burst provides healing over time for your active character. All in all, a super duper strong kit, super convenient, and it also makes her incredibly flexible when it comes to team options. In fact, I don't even want to go into any details here because you can fit her into almost anything. Just saying that Xilonen is currently part of the best team in the game with Mawika and Citlali, but she's also great with other very strong DPS units like Wriothesley, like Neuvillette, probably also going to be really good with Varesa and much more. So in case you're not that big of a plunge fan and you want to skip the Varesa part of the banner, then I think getting Xilonen is going to be a very, very big boost for pretty much any account out there. But so much for Xilonen, let's now talk Venti, and when it comes to Venti, you can kinda sorta feel that we're talking about a version 1 character here. See, His kit is incredibly simple. His elemental skill is mainly used for particle generation or for exploration to generate that wind current on which you can ride upwards. But when it comes to combat, then he's all about his elemental burst, which creates a sort of black hole that sucks in nearby characters, and because it is a Nemo, it also swirls all types of elements that get into it. And about his burst, I think there's a bit of a misconception among many players out there. See, a lot of people in the community keep saying that Venti is trash, but technically this is not quite the truth. In fact, I would even go so far to say that he is actually pretty darn OP with his burst. And that is exactly the problem. Because his burst is so super duper strong, the game sort of shifted directions in a way where he would rarely even get the chance to make his burst shine. Here's what I mean. As I just said, the burst creates a black hole that sucks in nearby enemies. The problem with this is that it can only suck in smaller and medium-sized enemies and not the really big ones. However, the problem here is that it is usually the very big enemies who are the strong foes where you would really want to deal all that damage from the burst. So we kind of end up in a situation where Venti is very strong, but only against those characters who are, by definition, not really that much of a threat. However, regardless of how you want to word it, I personally still wouldn't recommend pulling for Venti because I believe he doesn't provide as much account value. But hey, if you like collecting Archons, if you want to get him, that's still perfectly fine, you do you. In that case, what you want to make sure when team building is, put him together with any type of elemental characters where you can swirl their elements around, which means he is very, very, very flexible, can be used in all reaction teams using the 4 base elements, and I would say he's also pretty free to play friendly in that sense, because all you need to do is put Viridescent Venera on him, give him as much elemental mastery as possible, and that's it. Okay. So much for the 5-star characters that we can expect in version 5.5. However, of course, these banners will be paired with their respective 4-star characters, and unfortunately at this point we don't have any dedicated information yet on what that will be. I'm gonna keep you up to date on that, but I've heard a couple speculations that would make sense, so I also want to share some thoughts here. First of all, it is pretty much guaranteed that Xianyun will be running alongside Varesa because the two are basically meant to go together and be the best in slot for each other. Then, I've also heard some voices that they might put Gaming on the Varesa banner as well, which in my opinion would be actually really great news because Gaming, just like Varesa, is a plunge attack DPS, and don't be fooled by the 4 stars, Gaming is actually really darn strong if you have his C6. The reason it would be so awesome if Gaming was on the Varesa banner is Xianyun is also on the Varesa banner, and Xianyun is the dedicated plunge damage support. So that means if you pull Varesa, you need Xianyun anyway, and that means you can also make good use of Gaming then when you get him on the side. And in case you only want to pull for Xianyun, maybe to use her as a team-wide healer or something, then getting some Gaming constellations in the process? Well, sign me up for that. Overall, it would be a big W if he got a rerun on the same banner. And then in the other phase, with Xilonen and Venti, I've heard some voices suspecting that we might see a Faruzan rerun, which wouldn't be too far-fetched because Faruzan is an Anemo buffer, therefore it would kind of make sense to put her together with Venti, but I wouldn't bet any money on it, and in general, the Xilonen and Venti banner both aren't that reliant on specific 4 stars as Varesa, Gaming, and Xianyun would be, so I think the 4 stars here will not matter all too much, though it would of course be awesome to have some good and long-awaited reruns. But before we call it a day, let's also talk about the 5-star weapons that will be on those banners, and for version 5.5, I actually think this is quite a big topic. Let me explain. First of all, I want to talk about Varesa's signature weapon. While we still not 100% know what exactly it will do, I think it is relatively obvious that this catalyst is not only going to be, of course, Varesa's best in slot weapon, but also I believe that this one will follow the unfortunate trend of new DPS characters really wanting their signature weapon, because when we take a look at the other catalysts that are currently available in the game, then of course there are some good crit stat sticks and stuff, but none of those catalysts really have anything that would benefit a plunging attack playstyle. Therefore, I believe Varesa will be significantly stronger with her signature weapon compared to other 5-star options. And if you ask me, that's kind of unfortunate, because Xianyun's catalyst, which will be on the same weapon banner of course, it is relatively dedicated just for her, and therefore doesn't provide that much overall account value. So yeah, long story short, on the Varesa Xianyun weapon banner, I really cross my fingers that you're gonna get the weapon that you want first try, because if you lose your 50-50 to the other respective weapon, that might not be all that great. However, when we're looking at the other weapon banner for Xilonen and Venti, then things look really good. In fact, I believe this is shaping up to be one of the best weapon banners we've had in a very long time. Here's what I mean. See, since it will be Xilonen and Venti as 5 stars on the banner, that means the accompanying 5-star weapons will be the Peak Patrol song as well as the Elegy for an End. And regardless of the characters, these two weapons are absolute bangers when it comes to increasing your team's damage output. The Elegy, for example, is a super awesome support boat that you can put on many characters other than Venti as well, because what it does is, it provides the entire team with 100 elemental mastery and 20% more attack. That is a really strong buff, and the only thing you need to do to trigger it is score a couple of hits with your elemental skill or elemental burst. Not only Venti himself can make good use of it, but also off-field characters like Fischl, like Auroron, like Faruzan, Goru, Kuchosara, or heck, even Xianyun. There are so many characters that can benefit from the Elegy and therefore buff your entire team. It is crazy. Therefore, regardless of Venti's questionable position in the meta, his bow is not only old, but also very gold. And as if that's not already awesome enough, let's now talk about the Peak Patrol song. This sword is also awesome for team buffing, because while yes, it is not going to be the most awesome stat stick providing defense as secondary attribute, it has a very easy to trigger effect that can give your entire team up to 25.6% elemental damage bonus. All you gotta do to trigger it is hit 2 normal attacks, that's it. And also here, there are so many characters other than Xilonen who could make great use of this sword to buff the entire team. For example, you could actually go and put this onto Bennett. In this case, you not only have this very strong attack buff from him, but he would provide elemental damage bonus as well. So long story short, both of these 5-star weapons are really good. So if you chose to pull on this weapon banner, even if you lose your 50-50 to the other respective weapon, you can be ensured that this one will also be really valuable for your account. And if you want to get tons of materials for all those juicy new characters that you're about to pull, then also check out my best daily and weekly routines right here. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, travel smart and have a great weekend.